Hi everybody, welcome back to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this video I'm going to be reviewing the 2024 Alex Garland film Civil War, which I found to be a huge disappointment actually, because there were no Civil War battles, there was no Robert E. Lee, Tecumseh Sherman, any of the big important figures, the big epic battles that we know, the skirmishes and the heroics and the awful slaughter in the South and the North, and there was none of that. It was an absolute... Sorry, hold on. What? What do you mean it's not that Civil War? It's called the Civil War. It's about the Civil War, right? Because it's called Civil War. If it's not about the Civil War, why are the Avengers not in it then? Oh, okay. There seems to have been a bit of a misunderstanding here. Typical Hollywood, always lying. There should have been a disclaimer at the start of this film that it's not actually about the Civil War. And as a result, I have crafted a completely flawed and totally unacceptably false review about this film because I was lied to. I'm the victim here in all of this. I think you understand and see what's going on here. I've been lied to. This is so typical of the establishment, the elites, always lying, and I am a victim of quite a serious... In fact, I think I might take a lawsuit. I think I might. In fact, get me the studio, figure out who the studio is. We're gonna file papers. This is serious stuff. I mean, you can't just go around making a film called Civil War that's not actually about... Have you found who it is? Could you hurry up, please? I don't pay you minimum wage not to do my bidding when I need you to do my bidding. Could you hurry up? Because the people here, they're expecting a review, and I need to sue these people for misleading and false advertising. Quite clearly, that's what's going on here. In the meantime, I'm going to need to rewatch this whole movie and recraft my entire approach to this video. But don't worry, we will come back and we will experience the future together, the prospects of what is unshackled from what has been. Roll tape. When you're up against the wall and you cannot fall, so go off, go off, go off. Okay, so I was only joking, but I'm not joking about this. But before we start, if you're not a subscriber to the channel, please hit that little subscribe button, sign away your life. It doesn't cost you anything to do that. And also, please give this video a like if you enjoy the content. All of that really, really helps these videos. And obviously this goes without saying, but if you haven't already seen the movie, there's going to be spoilers. So you're probably going to want to shut this video off and come back later after you've watched the 2024 Alex Garland film Civil War, because I'm just going to be spoiling a ton of stuff as I share my thoughts on this movie. Now, as we jump into this review, one other thing I should say is you've probably already noticed this because you're very astute viewers. I am not at home at the moment. I'm not in my office. I'm actually on the road. I'm currently in Australia, actually, and so I've bought some portable recording gear with me, and I am recording this thing on the fly. The audio is not up to my usual high standards, but hopefully everything is more than passable, and you'll still have an enjoyable experience watching this video, unlike me, a man who was lied to, watching a film, and I was completely deceived about what the real content of the movie actually was. But being a good Christian man like I am, I don't hold grudges. There is no... I'm not holding on to any bitterness about this. Let's just get on with this. Okay, so there's two things I want to focus on when I'm reviewing this film, Civil War. The first is the plot itself and I guess the substance of the movie. And the second is the politics, because this thing is loaded with politics and they are very, very unsubtle. And so I want to share my thoughts on both. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just dissect and go through some points, some notes that I wrote about the film. I watched this film several months ago, but I took quite comprehensive notes at the time when I was watching the movie, and so I thought I'd just share some of the things that really stuck out to me, because overall I'd have to say that I found this film to be a competent yet frustrating film that just was a bit of a nothing burger. It's a movie you get to the end of and it just doesn't stay with you because there's nothing really memorable about this film. Now, by the way, I'm going to be looking off to the side of the screen a little bit because I've got my notes on a computer that is rather haphazardly balanced on one of my luggage cases turned on its side, so hopefully nothing falls over partway through this video, but you might see my eyes darting across to this side of the screen. So overall, I'd say that this film, I think the plot is just very weak. It could be described, I think, accurately as a day in the life of some fictional media type characters, some fictional journalists, as they inhabit a purely fictional war zone. But the problem is, we don't really know enough about this war zone, I think, to be well engaged. And also the main concept, the main conceit of the plot doesn't really make sense. Like, it really does stretch credulity to think that a group of journalists in the dying days of a violent civil war would desperately try and make their way across into enemy lines to get into the bunker of the dictator, who is the enemy of the people, according to this film, to try and record an interview with him. I don't see any point in them doing that. If I transport us all the way back to World War II and think about that context, can you imagine a journalist from the Allied side trying to do something like that? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's not something that people would be applauding or people would be considering to be a priority. And in many ways, it sort of just exposes the vacuousness of these characters. They don't think like sane and rational people. And I don't know if that's actually meant to be a deliberate part of the plot or not. I think this might just be that this is a particularly flawed story that we're watching. And so we're watching these characters do this crazy thing that just doesn't make sense. And in a better and more well-written story, this wouldn't have been the main driving point of the movie. Just think about the fact that these are journalists who are in a war zone where all journalists are being killed by one side, the opposing side, the very side they're trying to get an interview with. It seems like it wouldn't just be a foolish mission to try and attempt, it would be absolute suicide. Like, it's guaranteed if they catch you in a zone where they are killing journalists on sight, because that's what they do, you're going to get shot on sight. So why would you even go on this mission? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And then for some bizarre and I think woefully unexplained reason, our main character, Lee, played by Kirsten Dunst, develops PTSD in that very final battle. In fact, in the very final moments, it really ramps up in a big way, and then ends up getting killed in a truly bizarre and I think extremely contrived moment. They needed her to die in that scene, and they were looking for her to die in a particular way. If you've seen the film, you know what I'm talking about. And they couldn't really, I think, figure out a more creative way of doing that than to say, let's just give her PTSD. But that's not really been a particularly strong hallmark of her character. She comes across more as a jaded cynic throughout the rest of the film, not someone who is suffering from, or certainly not overt PTSD, like she suddenly develops when the plot needs her to develop overtly traumatic and dramatic and deleterious PTSD symptoms, where all of a sudden she's actually at great risk because of her symptoms. This didn't really make any sense. It just came out of nowhere. And on top of that, none of the characters are actually particularly sympathetic in this film. None of them. They just don't feel relatable. And I think that's a big problem, because if you're going to make a movie about a fictional war zone, and you're not going to actually focus on the war itself, you're not going to draw back and give us the bigger picture, which this film doesn't do. It focuses in on the minutiae of these specific characters who are living through this fictional fantasy civil war zone, then you better give us a really good set of characters that we can engage with. And you really better dedicate yourself well to the skill and the craft of writing that minutiae well, so that it's engaging. Otherwise, we're going to end up with what we ended up with here, and that was a film that just wasn't that enjoyable because you don't relate to any of the characters. You don't like the characters. I'm looking at these characters and I'm thinking, none of them are sympathetic. None of them speak to me, and I don't know who they would actually speak to. Maybe, just maybe, if you're perhaps a working woman who's committed to feminism and has said, I'm going to have career over kids or something like that, then maybe Kirsten Dunst is, like, her character, I was going to call her Kirsten Dunstan. That's not her name at all, though, is it? But Kirsten Dunst, maybe her character and her, you go get him, girl, that drive that she shows at the beginning, or maybe the other character, the young influencer slash journalist, we'll get to her in a minute, who wants to desperately imitate her hero. Maybe that might resonate with you if you're one of those types, but it seems like a very, very narrow and small group of people to try and appeal to. But even then, I just don't think those people would find these characters particularly relatable or enjoyable. And particularly as the film goes, I think they sort of have moments. Kirsten Dunst is not a total write-off. There are moments where you see the promise of what could have been if only they had unburdened themselves from what was in this plot. And if this was actually meant to be an ode to war zone journalists, which I have a funny feeling maybe they were going for a bit of that angle as well, this actually just ends up making them look like vacuous, deviant, and heartless adrenaline junkies, basically. That's all they are. And on top of that, the mission that they are engaged in, which is the main focus of this film, is absolutely stupid. It's a suicide mission that is totally pointless. And so it's like, why would this be seen as an ode to war zone journalists? If this is how they conduct themselves, then quite frankly, they are all nuts, and maybe they should be getting therapy, not plane tickets to go into war zones. Now, in saying that, there are moments, though, in this movie where there are interesting things that really, I think, should have been touched on. So the two big things for me is that scene where they're trying to get petrol or gas, if you're in the United States of America. They come across a war crime, or what looks like a war crime, and Kirsten Dunst's character tells us, she tells another character, and by doing that, she tells us, our job is just to document. In other words, our job is actually just to take footage, and then other people will come back later and they will decide if war crimes have been committed and exactly who are the guilty parties here. Now, that is a very important ethical discourse, I think, a conversation that is actually worthy of having and should be had. But the problem is that this film doesn't actually do that. It doesn't linger on that important point. It doesn't have the deep moral conversation that needs to be had, because I'm actually not convinced that that is a particularly compelling moral philosophy to live your life by, even if you're a photojournalist in a war zone. Surely your first obligation is to be a person of character and of virtue. And if a human person is being violated in some way and you have the capacity to actually stop that violation, then surely your first priority is to the injured party, and it is to do what is morally right and just. It is not just to say, well, I'm here just to take photos and someone else will sort it out later. Because later on that person could conceivably be dead and you might have been in a position to actually save their life. And it's no good, as far as I'm concerned, then turning around and saying, well, look, but I documented evidence of this so we can prosecute the person. Wouldn't it be much better, more humane, if we actually saved a life rather than prosecuted someone for taking a life after they've killed that victim we could have saved? See, that's an interesting dialogue. That's an important conversation that could have been had, that is associated with the minutiae of this film, but they don't really linger on this long enough. They don't have the dialogue. They don't have the conversation. And then there is the infamous Jesse Plemons character, the guy who's kind of like a modern-day American warlord. And the trailer, I think, is a bit misleading in this regard. It leads us to believe that perhaps he's going to play a bigger role in this film than what he actually does, when in reality he is a very small cameo bit part character in all of this. But that's a problem, because I actually think there's an interesting point to be explored there, and I think it could have been a lot more fascinating if they had been kidnapped by that character. And so the film had taken its time and dedicated more time to a sort of subplot where the main characters are kidnapped by him, and then they can actually then engage in dialogue with this character, and we can start to understand motivations, and we can start to get our head around what's going on. As it is, we just get this very, I think, cheap snapshot moment that just feels a little bit too cliched. It's like, oh look, he's a warlord. Oh look, here's a mass grave. Oh look, he's a racist and he's killing people and dumping their bodies in the mass grave. And it's like, tick, 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 we ticked all the boxes, job done. But instead of doing that, what if that actually focused in on what would have been far more interesting, which would have been trying to understand what motivates someone to commit such barbaric acts of evil, trying to understand who he was before the Civil War, where he's come from. Because if this guy had been quite an ordinary character who had suddenly found himself engaging in these awful behaviours, there's like there's something interesting and important there that can be explored and I think is worthy of our exploration. And I think particularly in light of the fact that this is actually a fictional civil war, it would have been far better if they'd taken the time, I think, to dedicate plot to exploring how this war came about. Why was this fictional war happening? Because that's actually quite an important and interesting thing to explore. And I think it's actually much more important than what we saw on screen. Because there are commentators who have been talking for some years now about the fact that America is facing a very real possibility of a very imminent civil war. And so that, it seems, is an interesting and very important topic to explore. A filmmaker who delves into how this could happen, I think, is probably of more use than a filmmaker who just takes that for granted and dives into this sort of pointless minutiae of this ode to journalists who are ultimately characters that we just don't care about. And then the ending is ultimately, I think, just pointless because we don't draw back and see the bigger picture of the actual Civil War. We don't find out enough about it to really care either way about the death of this character. Basically what happens is the film says to you, hey, here's some tick box cliches. This guy's Hitler. He shoots journalists. He's a bad guy. He's living in his bunker. You should just trust us when we say that we need to kill this guy and his death is a good thing. It's presented in kind of like this way where you're just supposed to accept that. And I think there's a reason for that, which I'm going to get into in a minute when we talk about the politics of this. But basically I got to the end of this film and I just felt empty. It didn't feel like anything meaningful, and it certainly didn't feel like it had anything meaningful to say about the human condition or war that other and far superior movies haven't already done in a far more compelling and meaningful way. So when I see people writing IMDb reviews and they're saying things like, this is an important film about the horrors of war, I'm like, it's actually not. There are many other films that we could recommend that explore the horrors of war in a far more compelling way, and in a way that really sticks with you, and in a way that goes much deeper than the sort of superficial surface mining stuff that we see in Civil War. The problem is that I think ultimately I just didn't really care much about these characters, and their quest doesn't make any meaningful sense. It's not a noble quest. It's self-aggrandizing, and it's a self-aggrandizing quest carried out by a group of self-aggrandizers who are just selfish, characterless, virtueless people. And it doesn't resonate. There's not even something to aspire to. And if you're going to tell a story like this and you're going to put us in the middle of what is supposed to be a noble quest, then you better make sure that it's actually a noble quest. And you better make sure that those characters really are heroes. Otherwise, this whole thing is just going to fall flat. And I kind of wonder whether this is because the studio actually got involved and made a mess of things here. Like, it feels like maybe it was meant to be a bit of an ode to the media, but the timing and the telling of the story, I think, was just so badly misjudged, because the general population right now, and I think rightly so, has great distrust and cynicism towards the mainstream media. So the timing of a film like this just doesn't make sense, where you're trying to make an ode to the media, an ode to journalists. And then on top of that, the way the story is crafted, these people are not likable. They're actually really dislikable characters, and their quest is not noble. So it's not like you can look past their character flaws and say, well, at least their quest was noble, because their quest is just this pointless suicide mission. And like I said, I wonder if this is because the studio got involved in all of this and decided to interfere. Like they said, no, Mr. Garland, you'll not tell that story. And so as a result, this film feels like maybe there's stuff on the cutting room or the writing room floor that should have been in the movie, that like they would have leaned into things a bit more. But as it was, they tried to take this weird sort of middle ground where they are quote unquote playing it safe. But ultimately, you end up with a story that is just very forgettable. It's just not compelling. They don't lean into anything that they really should have leaned into. I probably could have had a bit more respect if they'd leaned really hard into the progressive politics, which clearly is what underpins this film. We'll get to that in just a second. But they didn't do that, and so there's no real authentic voice in the story. There's nothing for me or you to actually, if you disagree with the politics, to sort of push up against. And the artistic merit, that should have been there, is just, it's lost. It's not there. It's a film that is just, it's nothing. It's an hour and 45 minutes or so of nothing. Which brings me to the politics, because A lot of people who have watched this film have claimed that this movie took a centrist position on the current divisive nature of US politics. Now, I'm not sure what movie these people went to watch, but I'm telling you right now that it seems pretty obvious to me that this was not a centrist film. I just don't think that it is at all believable to say that this movie was trying to walk the line and explore nuance and all the rest of it. I went into this film believing that because I'd seen reviewers claiming that that's what this movie did. But in actual fact, it was very clear to me that this was not a subtle film about politics at all. They didn't leave the politics at the back door. It's very unsubtle in its politics. Let me give you a list of ways in which this film is clearly an anti-Trump movie. Now, forget about whether you like or dislike Trump, and my personal take is that if I was in America and I had to vote, I'm not an American, but if I had to vote in the current two-party system and looking at the current situation, I would hold my nose and I would vote for Trump. There are things that I like about Trump's policy set, and there are things about Trump in particular that I find really quite frustrating and distasteful, but I would rather have that over the other option. So that's where I land on this. But forget about that. You might have a completely different view. You might totally dislike the man, and you might be someone who says, well, I'm going to vote for Harris if I get the opportunity, or if I had the opportunity, that's where I would be voting. It's not about your politics. It's about the politics of this particular film. And let me present the case now as to why this was a very unsubtle and clearly, I think, anti-Trump piece. And like this, the frustrating thing is it didn't actually need to be there. And I think that really cheapens the film, because I think there's a really interesting and compelling story. If they could just get themselves away from the Trump derangement syndrome, I think they could tell some really compelling and important stories about American politics, particularly the situation right now. But they just can't unshackle themselves. They are stuck. They cannot find the future unshackled from what has been, because they are so obsessed by what has been. But let's have a look at some of the practicalities of what we see portrayed in this film. This dictatorship is literally set up like the Third Reich, and in fact it's presented like the fall of the Third Reich, complete with the Führer's loyal forces and advisors who are attempting to flee the bunker. He's hunkered down. The White House has been turned into a bunker effectively, and he's hunkered down in his bunker. This is the repeat of the Third Reich. This is, I guess, the post-war liberal narrative. And in this case, remember, we've been told so many times they believe Trump is Hitler. So you shouldn't be surprised when they borrow the iconography, if you like, or the imagery or the events of the downfall of Hitler and put them into this film about an American Civil War. It didn't need to be this way. It could have been something completely different, but they're trying to make a point. There is also a literal wall around the White House. Like, it's just very unsubtle. They've built a wall. He's got his wall. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. He's got his wall. Get it? There's a wall, and it's around the White House. Like, it's just not subtle. He's wearing a big red tie. Again, this is not subtle. He has disbanded the FBI. Wow. Gosh, I wonder who they're thinking of there. So hard to tell. Much brain work, little effort, little outcome. I don't know. Who could it be? There's an event that is referred to in the film as the Antifa massacre, and we don't really find out what that actually is. It's just referenced in dialogue partway through the film, but you get the strong sense that the Antifa massacre wasn't what it actually probably would have been, which was Antifa revolutionaries engaging in violent behaviours and killing a whole lot of people, which is more likely to be the real world scenario. Instead, I'm pretty sure this is meant to be Antifa, the anti-fascists, getting massacred. And of course, they're getting massacred by the brown shirts. And I think maybe this is where you see possibly, and I say possibly because I don't know, but possibly the interference of a studio that said, hey, let's just change the writing a little bit here, because maybe there was other dialogue that made it a lot more clearer what they actually meant. And the studio said, get that out. Just leave the unsubtle references in there, but don't explain it. Don't over-explain it. The film starts, remember, with a president, the bad guy, the dictator president, giving a press conference in which he is espousing things in a way that Trump would espouse them. Now, you're kind of fooled by this, I think, because he's not using a Trump voice. He's not imitating Trump. But go back and watch again some of the things he says. There is an unsubtle nod to Trump there when he starts talking about this military victory, and he's engaging in this clearly dishonest and hyperbolic exaggeration about his military prowess, and he starts saying at one point even that, this is one of the greatest battles ever fought, and they're going to say that about this battle. Now, if you do that in a Trump accent, pretty quickly you get the point of what they're trying to do here. It becomes obvious what's going on. They're drawing back, again, they're drawing back to the man that they see as their political enemy. He is the target of their ire, I think, in this film. They have Nick Offerman playing the president in all of this. Now, if I was going to pick someone to play a president in a film where I was really trying to give an unsubtle nod to the president actually being Donald Trump, then I'd probably pick a character who is most famous, well, I think in my mind anyway, I think probably for most people, isn't this fair to say? Leave your comments in the comment section below, that Nick Offerman is most well known for playing a MAGA type character in Parks and Recreation, the character of Ron Swanson, the steak-eating, red-blooded Republican MAGA type character. And so if you were going to have someone to typecast into the role of Trump, that's who you would do it. It doesn't seem too far-fetched, does it, to see that as a deliberate decision? Because typically those presidential actor types, they're not portrayed like that. They're more the square, jaw-lined type actors who get to play the president unless they're playing a real president and they try and find someone who looks like the real president. But in this case, it's a fictional president, and I'm pretty sure they've gone for a character who looks like he could be Trump-esque in nature. The journalists in this dictatorial regime of the enemy president are public enemy number one. Again, this is really unsubtle stuff. Mr. Fake News is now targeting the media in a very real and violent and lethal kind of way. That's the big hype, remember, that the sort of the fear-mongering of the progressives for many years now has been, oh, look at this, he wants to destroy the press. We are told that this is his third term as president, so clearly voting has been suspended or rigged in some way. This is exactly the fear-mongering that we've heard about Trump from the progressive side of politics for several years now. He's going to get into office and he's not leaving. He's not going anywhere. If you vote for him, he will end all voting. And it's like, okay, so this guy in this film has clearly done that. There is a kill order on this president, which kind of seems a bit strange if you think about the context. Like, why wouldn't they just go into his territory, arrest him, and then put him on trial, subject him to a trial? That's typically what you do, right, in these situations, particularly, I think, in the American context. He's still an American, even if he is a dictatorial president, so why wouldn't they go and arrest him and then put him on trial for his crimes? Well, maybe, just maybe, again, this is an unsubtle nod to Trump because they see Trump as such a danger. Even his mere presence can stir up new brown shirts, and maybe he's too dangerous even to keep alive because he might win the trial and then, I don't know, take control again. That's really the way in which they view Trump. And they have this sort of weird, over-exaggerated, demonic set of powers that they attribute to this man. And so it kind of makes sense of why in this film, this particular character, it would be shoot on sight, because they actually think of him in the way that currently they think of Trump. Now, some people might say, but Brendan, hold on a minute. Florida and Texas, they were the Western powers. So doesn't that kind of upend your whole narrative here? Doesn't this undermine your claim that this was meant to be Trump? Because wouldn't Florida and Texas go with Trump? Well, first of all, I don't know if that's actually guaranteed at all. And secondly, I think this might be a very small piece of plausible deniability so that they could put the film out there, and then if people say to them, hey, what's going on with the politics of this movie, they can say, hey, man, just chill out, bro. Look at it. Florida and Texas are fighting this guy, so how can this be Trump? Right? It's kind of, I think there's a bit of gaslighting going on here, and it's also plausible deniability, and I kind of wonder whether even the studios might have got involved here and said, can you just throw something in there that might maybe throw people off the scent just enough so that we can sort of, if we ever get in trouble over this, we can say, no, it's a balanced, nuanced film. It's walking the middle line. It's a centrist exploration of an important issue. And of course, the last and important aspect of this movie is the fact that it has been released in the months leading up to an election. This year is presidential election year, and this is one of the big films that gets released leading into the presidential election year. To me, it doesn't seem like an accident that you've got this character who is the enemy president, who has destroyed America, who has pulled it into this violent, evil civil war, and he seems to tick a lot of the boxes that are also the tick boxes of the progressive fever dream, the anti-Trump derangement sort of fever dream that they have about this guy. It just seems to be a little bit too coincidental and rather odd that he happens to tick a whole lot of these boxes. And I think this is an interesting thing because in light of what's happened since, like when I watched this film many months ago, there hadn't been 2 assassination attempts. We've had now 2 deranged characters who have had failed assassination attempts on Donald Trump. Now, going back and thinking about and preparing for this video today, I thought to myself, I wonder if there is any way to check the streaming histories of these 2 gentlemen and to see what content they've been watching. I'd be quite fascinated to know if they've actually seen this film and how often maybe they saw this film, because it would seem to play into that fever dream as well, and that very toxic political rhetoric that is doing great harm in America. And that's one of the things that I think I found so frustrating about this film, is because this film could have actually been a proper moral exploration of these issues. It could have drawn back, and by exploring in more detail the actual things that led up to and caused the causative factors of the Civil War, that would have, I think, been a truly centrist thing to do in a more compelling film. But in actual fact, they don't do this. It seems to me to be just sort of cheap, tawdry politics. But at the end of the day, regardless of what your politics are and what the intentional politics of this film were, this just felt like a technically proficient, like the visuals and other aspects were all well crafted, but meaningless 1 hour and 45 minutes. There was no deeper exploration, like I said, of the moral injustices and the violence that this film sort of touches on. It doesn't really go into that in a much deeper way. It's just a bunch of fictional media types either being shocked or shell-shocked by what they see, and this quest that's not really noble at all. It's a suicide mission, and at the end of the day, they're just sort of self-aggrandizing, self-interested people who come across more like unhinged, I think at times anyway, unhinged social media influencers. And I know there might be some people out there thinking, oh, but Brendan, you don't get it. It's this profound journey that a young, naive and aspiring photojournalist called Jessie goes on as she becomes more and more calloused to the violence she experiences, and ultimately she ends up becoming just like Kirsten Dunst's character at the very end. Sorry, I just realised I called her Kirsten Dunst, didn't I? Dunst. Isn't it? It is, isn't it? I put the T on the end. Sorry about that. I don't think she's watching, but that's not really meant to be offensive. I think she's a good actor, by the way. And I think also I should say that there is a compelling story that left-wing filmmakers can make about these issues, but this is not it. Because this particular character here of Jessie, if they'd written her properly, she would have been the moral compass. Out of her sort of naivete, she would have been challenging their moral indifference, but instead that's not what happens. She's this character who's effectively part of this moral indifference right from the very beginning. And there's sort of fleeting naivety, but it's not the kind you need. She needs to be the moral compass. I'll give you a good example of this. The film and the book, The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And in that movie, the son becomes the moral compass, the very important moral compass at key moments. Out of his youthful naivety and beautiful childlike innocence, he challenges the father, who at 1 or 2 moments has become calloused. And in fact, he specifically asks him at one point in that story, are we still the good guys? You know, do we have the fire alive inside of us still, like you've told me we're supposed to have? And you see, that's the type of character this film needed, but it didn't get that. So by all means, if you want to make a film about a tyrannical president who has caused a civil war in America, then make that film and tell that story and do it properly. But this film didn't do that. In fact, this film strikes me as the political version of Cloverfield. It's kind of like a movie that's got all of this hype around it, but very little substance. Once you get over the hype and the PR marketing and everything else around this and the impressive visuals, you realise it's kind of paper thin. There's not really much going on here. The film is missing what it could have been. it is unburdened by what, no, it is burdened by what has been. It's too late. This video's gone too long already, but let me finish it just to sort of prove that I'm not making stuff up and I'm not just spouting utter nonsense. Let me read to you now some IMDb reviews from people and what they thought about this movie. And I think you'll get a consistent and generally ongoing and recurring theme about how different viewers from all over the place feel about this movie, and it's pretty much in agreement with what I've said to you in this video. And by the way, I'm looking down at my iPad here, so you'll just have to forgive me if I break the rules of filming a YouTube video. I'm on the road. Felt like a missed opportunity. Underneath all the noise, it had nothing to say. I'm just reading you the headlines that people have given their own reviews. There's a civil war somewhere, just not in this movie. Here's another one. A lot of emptiness. Forgettable. Wanted to love it. Ended up frustrated. This one here says, it doesn't take sides, it just serves as a reminder, war is hell. Sure, but there are films that do this far better and far more convincingly and in a far more compelling kind of way than this one does. Weak dialogue and character development. Disturbing, brilliant and essential. No, it's definitely not that. Too afraid to have a message. That's what I said. It just didn't lean into anything. This one's quite funny. Former FBI agent perspective. One of the most important films in history. Really? A movie in which a fictional dictator disbands the FBI is, according to a former FBI agent, one of the most important films in history. Oh yeah, God bless him. Disappointing. This isn't a Civil War movie, it's a movie about a photographer. And they gave that 4 out of 10. Thin and insubstantial. Corny. Lacking impact. Interesting, boring, interesting, boring, interesting, the end. Walked out after 40 minutes. I could go on. The very next one says a complete disappointment. It just goes on and on and on like this. People looked at this film and saw exactly what I saw in this movie. A film that just doesn't really have much of any importance to say about what is actually a potentially very serious issue, according to certain commentators, that America is now staring down the barrel of. And there was an opportunity here to do something really interesting, but they didn't do it. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. And if you enjoy this video content, then please join us at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. If you become a $5 monthly patron, you will get access to an exclusive daily episode of audio commentary on the Dispatches podcast that I produce every single day of the week, Monday through Friday. And moving forward, I've told my patrons this, but if you're a YouTube channel subscriber, you won't know this yet. I have now committed myself to once a month, I am going to take a whole week, block out a week, and I'm not going to produce audio podcast episodes that week. Normally I produce a daily episode, and the time that I would have spent on those episodes, I'm going to spend producing a new piece of YouTube video commentary on film and television issues. And so once a month moving forward, starting from here, there will be a brand new YouTube video every single month. I started out this year and I tried to add YouTube videos or a return to regular YouTube videos on top of all of the other busy demands that I have in my life, young family, ministry work, and all sorts of other things, and the audio podcast and everything else. And basically, I pretty much came this close to total burnout, and so it just didn't work. And so I realized I had to come about this a slightly different way and work smarter, not harder. And so I want to get back into the space, and my commitment to you is that starting from this month, this video onwards, there will be a monthly YouTube video, because I'm going to take the time out to actually dedicate to that and make it a part of the regular normal schedule, not something I try and just add to the on top of everything else, because as you know, it takes a bit more time to actually produce video content, particularly in post-production, than it does an audio podcast. Again, thanks heaps for tuning in, and a huge thank you to our patrons. If you're not a patron and you want to support these videos, go to patreon.com/leftfootmedia. The link is in today's video, and become a $5 monthly patron. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget, live by goodness, truth and beauty, not by lies, and I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.